He shows off his young mistress. Crowd gasps when his ex-wife steps out with a prince. The invitation had arrived a month ago, nestled amongst a pile of bills and junk mail, a stark white rectangle of cardstock that felt heavier than it should. It was an invitation to the annual Hail Charity Gala, an event that had once been the highlight of Mara's social calendar. Now it felt like a summons, a deliberate twisting of the knife in a wound that refused to heal. Victor, her ex-husband, was one of the event's primary sponsors. He would be there, of course, preening and posturing, a peacock in a bespoke suit. And he wouldn't be alone. Mara stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at her, a stranger in a midnight blue gown that shimmered like a star-dusted sky. The dress was a relic from her past life, a life of glittering parties and hollow smiles, a life she had thought she'd left behind. But tonight, she was stepping back into the gilded cage, not as a victim, but as a woman reborn. Her apartment, a cozy, sun-drenched space filled with books and plants, was a world away from the sterile mansion she had once called home. Here, she was surrounded by life, by things that grew and thrived under her care. It was a sanctuary she had built for herself, brick by painful brick, after the demolition of her marriage. The divorce had been brutal, a public spectacle orchestrated by Victor's high-powered legal team. He had painted her as a gold digger, a woman who had married him for his money and then grown bored. The truth, as always, was far more complex, a tapestry of quiet sacrifices and broken promises that no one but she would ever fully understand. She had met Victor in college, a whirlwind romance that had swept her off her feet. He was ambitious, charismatic, and utterly captivating. She had been a naive art student, drawn to his confidence like a moth to a flame. He had promised her the world, and for a while it had seemed as though he had delivered. But the world he had given her was a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside, but cold and empty within. Her art, once the vibrant pulse of her existence, had been relegated to a dusty corner of the mansion, her canvases and paints replaced by designer handbags and couture gowns. She had become an accessory, a beautiful object to be displayed on his arm, her own dreams and aspirations slowly suffocating under the weight of his expectations. The final betrayal had come in the form of a younger woman, a carbon copy of the girl Mara had once been, all wide-eyed innocence and eager smiles. Victor hadn't even had the decency to be discreet. He had paraded his affair in front of their friends, their family, the whole world, it seemed. And when she had finally found the courage to leave, he had tried to destroy her, to strip her of everything, including her dignity. But he had underestimated her. He had mistaken her kindness for weakness, her quiet resilience for passivity. He had forgotten the fire that had once burned so brightly within her, the passion that had once filled her canvases with color and life. That fire had been dormant for a long time, but it had never been extinguished, and in the ashes of her old life a new flame had been kindled, a flame of self-love and fierce independence. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her reverie. She took a deep breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. It was time. She opened the door to find him standing there, a vision of quiet strength and gentle reassurance. Johnson. He was her prince, though he would have laughed at the title. He was no royalty, at least not in the traditional sense. He was something far more valuable, a man who saw her, truly saw her, for the woman she was, not the woman he wanted her to be. He smiled, his eyes the color of warm honey, and the frantic drumming in her chest slowed to a steady rhythm. "You look breathtaking," he said, his voice a low, soothing melody. "And you," she replied, her own smile finally reaching her eyes. "Look like you're ready to slay some dragons." He chuckled, a rich, warm sound that filled the small apartment. "Only the metaphorical kind," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" She took his arm, her fingers curling around the soft fabric of his tuxedo jacket. As they stepped out into the cool night air, she knew that this was it, the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating for months. She was stepping back into the lion's den, but this time she was not alone, and this time she was not afraid. The ballroom of the Hale Hotel was a symphony of opulence, a dazzling display of crystal chandeliers, cascading floral arrangements, and the soft melodic hum of polite conversation. It was a world Mara knew all too well, a world where appearances were everything, and authenticity was a foreign concept. She could feel the familiar weight of it settling on her shoulders, the invisible pressure to smile, to charm, to be the perfect, polished version of herself. But then she felt Johnson's hand on the small of her back, a gentle, grounding touch that reminded her why she was here. She was not here to impress these people, to win their approval. She was here for herself, to prove that she was no longer the broken woman Victor had left behind. They moved through the crowd, a sea of familiar faces that turned to watch them pass. There were whispers, of course, hushed murmurs that followed them like a shadow. Mara could feel their eyes on her, their curious, speculative gazes. She had been a ghost for the past year, a phantom that haunted the edges of their social circle. Her reappearance was bound to cause a stir, and then she saw him, Victor. He was holding court in the center of the room, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. And on his arm, clinging to him like a particularly expensive piece of jewelry, was the girl, Tiffany. She was even younger than Mara had imagined, her face a mask of youthful perfection, her eyes wide and adoring as she gazed up at Victor. Mara's breath caught in her throat, a sudden sharp pang of a pain she had thought she had buried. It wasn't jealousy, not anymore. It was a ghost of a memory, a faint echo of the woman she had once been, the woman who had looked at Victor with that same blind adoration. Victor's eyes met hers across the crowded room, and for a fleeting moment she saw a flicker of something in their depths, something that looked almost like surprise. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual arrogance. He raised his glass in a mock toast, a silent, insolent gesture that made her blood run cold. "Are you all right?" Johnson's voice was a soft murmur in her ear, his concern a warm balm on her frayed nerves. She nodded, forcing a smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just admiring the decor." He followed her gaze, his eyes landing on Victor and Tiffany. He didn't say anything, but she felt his hand tighten ever so slightly on her back, a silent promise of support. They found a quiet corner near the French doors that led out onto the terrace, a small pocket of relative peace in the swirling chaos of the ballroom. From here, they had a clear view of the stage, where a well-known jazz singer was crooning a soulful melody. The auction was the main event of the evening, a chance for the city's elite to outbid each other for extravagant prizes, all in the name of charity. It was a game of one-upmanship, a public display of wealth and power that had always made Mara feel slightly ill. Victor, of course, was in his element. He bid on everything, his voice booming through the ballroom as he threw his money around like confetti. He was putting on a show, a performance for the benefit of the adoring crowd and for the young woman on his arm. And then came the final item, a private yacht trip to the Greek islands, a week of sun-drenched luxury that had everyone in the room buzzing with excitement. The bidding started high and climbed even higher, a frantic back-and-forth battle between two of the city's wealthiest men. But then, just as the auctioneer was about to bring the gavel down, Victor's voice cut through the tension. $1 million, he said, his voice laced with a triumphant arrogance. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. It was an outrageous sum, a blatant, unapologetic display of his wealth. He was not just bidding on a vacation, he was buying the admiration of the room, the envy of his peers. He turned to Tiffany, a smug, self-satisfied smile on his face. "A little getaway for us, my dear," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. And then, just as the auctioneer was about to declare him the winner, a new voice entered the fray, a calm, quiet voice that cut through the stunned silence of the room. $2 million. All heads turned to the back of the room, to the quiet corner where Mara and Johnson were standing. It was Johnson who had spoken, his voice calm and steady, his expression unreadable. Victor's face was a mask of disbelief, his jaw slack with shock. He stared at Johnson, then at Mara, his eyes narrowing with a sudden dawning comprehension. The auctioneer, recovering from his own surprise, cleared his throat. $2 million to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 2.5? The ballroom was silent, all eyes on Victor. He was trapped, caught in his own game of public one-upmanship. To back down now would be to admit defeat, to lose face in front of the very people he so desperately wanted to impress. He glared at Johnson, his eyes burning with a cold, impotent fury. 2.5, he snarled, his voice tight with anger. Johnson didn't even flinch. 3 million, he said, his voice as calm and steady as before. The crowd gasped again, a wave of disbelief and excitement rippling through the room. This was no longer an auction, it was a duel, a battle of wills between two powerful men. Victor was seething, his face a mottled shade of red. He was being played, and he knew it. He had been so focused on his own performance, so blinded by his own arrogance, that he had walked right into a trap. He opened his mouth to speak, to raise the bid again, but then he caught Mara's eye. She was looking at him, not with triumph, not with malice, but with a quiet, pitying sadness. And in that moment he saw it, the truth he had been so desperate to deny. He had lost her not to another man, but to himself. He had pushed her away, broken her spirit, and now she was stronger than he had ever been. He closed his mouth, the fight draining out of him. He was defeated, and he knew it. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the ballroom, sealing his fate. Sold for $3 million to the gentleman in the back. The room erupted in applause, a thunderous ovation that washed over Mara and Johnson. But Mara barely heard it. She was looking at Victor, at the broken, defeated man he had become. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt nothing but a profound and liberating sense of peace. The aftermath of the auction was a blur of congratulations and curious glances. People who had once looked through Mara as if she were invisible now clamored for her attention, their faces alight with a mixture of awe and intrigue. They wanted to know who her mysterious companion was, this man who had so effortlessly humbled the great Victor Hale. Johnson handled the attention with a quiet grace, his smile warm and genuine, his answers polite but vague. He was a master of deflection, a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who had no need for the validation of others. He was, Mara realized, the antithesis of Victor. They finally managed to escape to the terrace. The cool night air, a welcome relief from the stuffy, overheated ballroom. The city lights twinkled below them, a river of diamonds that stretched out to the horizon. "Well?" Mara said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That was unexpected." Johnson chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I thought it was rather entertaining," he said, his voice laced with a playful amusement. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" she said, playfully swatting his arm. "You enjoyed seeing him squirm." He shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Perhaps a little," he admitted, "but that wasn't the point." "Then what was the point?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He turned to face her, his expression growing serious. "The point," he said, his voice soft and sincere, "was to show you that you are not defined by him. You are not his victim, Mara. You are a strong, beautiful, and incredibly talented woman who deserves to be happy." Her breath hitched in her throat, her heart swelling with a wave of emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, with such genuine, unwavering belief in her worth. "And," he added, a twinkle returning to his eyes, "I've always wanted to visit the Greek islands." She laughed, a real, genuine laugh that came from the very depths of her soul. It was a sound she hadn't heard in a very long time, a sound she had thought she had forgotten how to make. Their moment of peace was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. They turned to see Victor and Tiffany approaching, their faces a stark contrast of anger and confusion. "What the hell was that?" Victor demanded, his voice a low, menacing growl. "It was an auction," Johnson replied, his voice calm and even. "I believe you were there." Victor's eyes narrowed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he sneered. "You think you can just waltz in here and make a fool of me?" "I didn't make a fool of you, Victor," Johnson said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You did that all on your own." Victor took a step forward, his face contorted with rage. But before he could say another word, Tiffany tugged on his arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and embarrassment. "Victor, stop it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're making a scene." He shook her off, his eyes still locked on Johnson. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a venomous promise. And then he turned to Mara, his eyes filled with a cold, contemptuous pity. "You've really stooped low, haven't you?" he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Hiring some gigolo to fight your battles for you." Mara's blood ran cold. The words were a slap in the face, a cruel, calculated attempt to wound her, to diminish her. But she would not let him. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting his with a steady, unwavering gaze. "Johnson is not a gigolo," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He's a friend, and he's more of a man than you will ever be." Victor's face darkened, a flash of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to cry, to run away, to be the weak, fragile woman he had always known. He had not expected this quiet strength, this fierce, unyielding defiance. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He was at a loss, disarmed by her unexpected resilience. And then, to her own surprise, Mara found herself feeling a strange, unexpected pang of pity for him. He was a man who had everything, and yet he had nothing. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, a gilded cage of wealth and power that had left him hollow and alone. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Victor," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a sad final sense of closure. "I truly do." And with that she turned and walked away, Johnson by her side. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew that she was leaving her past behind, that she was walking towards a future that was hers, and hers alone. As they left the hotel, the cool night air on their faces, Mara felt a sense of lightness, a feeling of liberation that was so profound it was almost dizzying. She had faced her dragon, and she had not been burned. She had walked back into the gilded cage, and she had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and finally, blessedly, free. The days following the gala were a whirlwind of speculation and gossip. The city's elite were abuzz with the news of Victor Hale's public humiliation, and Mara's mysterious prince was the talk of the town. Who was he? Where had he come from? And what was his connection to the quiet, unassuming artist who had once been Victor's wife? The truth, when it was finally revealed, was far more surprising than any of the wild rumors that had been circulating. Johnson wasn't a prince, not in the traditional sense. He was something far more impressive. He was a self-made man, a tech entrepreneur who had built his empire from the ground up. He was the founder and CEO of a revolutionary new software company, a company that was changing the face of the industry. He was also a philanthropist, a man who used his wealth and influence to make a difference in the world. He had started a foundation that provided scholarships for underprivileged students, and he was a major donor to a number of environmental charities. He was, in short, a man of substance, a man of integrity, a man who was everything Victor Hale was not. The revelation sent shockwaves through their social circle. Victor, who had always prided himself on his business acumen, was suddenly eclipsed by a man who was not only more successful, but also more respected. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow, and he did not swallow it gracefully. He launched a smear campaign against Johnson, planting stories in the tabloids that painted him as a ruthless businessman, a corporate shark who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He tried to dig up dirt on him, to find some skeleton in his closet that he could use to discredit him. But there was nothing to find. Johnson's life was an open book, his reputation impeccable. Mara watched from the sidelines, a mixture of anger and sadness churning within her. She had hoped that Victor would have the decency to let her go, to move on with his life and allow her to do the same. But it was clear that he was not capable of that. He was a man who could not stand to lose, a man who would rather burn the whole world down than admit defeat. But Victor's attacks had an unintended consequence. They brought Mara and Johnson closer together. They were united in their defiance, in their refusal to be bullied. They found solace in each other's company, a quiet understanding that transcended words. Johnson, for his part, was unfazed by Victor's attempts to tarnish his name. He had faced far worse in his life, far greater challenges than the petty machinations of a jealous ex-husband. He had grown up in poverty, a scholarship kid who had fought his way into a prestigious university, who had worked 3 jobs to put himself through school. He had known hardship, he had known struggle, and he had emerged from it all with his spirit intact, his integrity unblemished. He saw Victor for what he was, a small, insecure man who used his wealth and power to mask his own deep-seated feelings of inadequacy. He pitied him more than anything else. One evening, as they were sitting in Mara's apartment, the city lights twinkling outside the window, Johnson turned to her, his expression serious. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice soft. He led her to her art studio, the room she had so carefully and lovingly created for herself. It was her sanctuary, her sacred space, the one place in the world where she felt truly free. He walked over to a large canvas-covered easel in the corner of the room, a piece she had been working on for months, a piece that was both deeply personal and intensely private. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering over the canvas. She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. No one had ever seen this painting before, no one but her. It was a self-portrait, but not in the traditional sense. It was a portrait of her soul, a swirling, chaotic mix of colors and emotions that represented the turmoil and the pain of the past few years. He lifted the canvas and his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the painting for a long time, his eyes tracing the lines and curves, the light and the shadow. "It's magnificent," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, unadulterated awe. He turned to her, his eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and understanding. "You are an incredible artist, Mara," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "You have a gift." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging. Victor had always dismissed her art, had called it a hobby, a silly little pastime. He had never seen the passion, the pain, the raw, unfiltered emotion that she poured into every brushstroke. But Johnson saw it. He saw her. "I want to help you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I want to help you share this with the world." He told her about a new art gallery that was opening in the city, a gallery that was dedicated to showcasing the work of emerging artists. He knew the owner, a woman who was a passionate and influential patron of the arts. He wanted to introduce them, to show her Mara's work. Mara was hesitant. The thought of putting her art, her soul, on display for the world to see was terrifying. It was a vulnerability she wasn't sure she was ready for. But then she looked at Johnson, at the unwavering belief in his eyes, and she knew that she had to try. She had to take this leap of faith, not just for him, but for herself. She had to prove that she was no longer afraid, that she was ready to step out of the shadows and into the light. And so, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, she agreed. She would have her own unveiling, her own grand entrance into the world, not as Victor Hale's ex-wife, but as Mara, the artist. The weeks leading up to the gallery opening were a blur of activity. Mara worked tirelessly, pouring all of her energy, all of her emotion, into her art. She painted with a feverish intensity, her studio becoming a whirlwind of color and canvas. She was no longer just painting. She was excavating her own soul, unearthing the long-buried pieces of herself and bringing them to light. Johnson was her constant companion, her unwavering source of support. He brought her meals when she forgot to eat. He reminded her to sleep when she worked late into the night, and he was always there with a word of encouragement, a gentle smile, a quiet, reassuring presence that gave her the strength to keep going. He never offered his opinion on her work unless she asked for it, and when she did, his feedback was always thoughtful, insightful, and incredibly helpful. He had a keen eye for art, a deep appreciation for the creative process that she had never encountered before. He understood her, not just as a woman but as an artist. The owner of the gallery, a chic, sophisticated woman named Isabella, was equally impressed. She saw the raw, untamed talent in Mara's work, the powerful, emotional honesty that set her apart from other artists. She gave Mara the entire gallery for her solo exhibition, a rare and incredible opportunity for a relatively unknown artist. The night of the opening was a surreal experience. The gallery was packed, a sea of faces that included art critics, collectors, and some of the city's most influential people. Mara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her stomach, but this time it was different. It was not the dread of judgment, but the thrill of anticipation. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her work, her life story laid bare for all to see. The paintings were a chronicle of her journey, from the dark, muted tones of her marriage to the vibrant, explosive colors of her newfound freedom. There were portraits of pain, of loss, of heartbreak. But there were also portraits of hope, of resilience, of rebirth. And in the center of it all, the centerpiece of the exhibition, was the self-portrait, the one Johnson had first unveiled. It was a powerful, arresting image, a woman's face emerging from a chaotic swirl of color, her eyes filled with a mixture of vulnerability and strength. It was a portrait of a woman who had been broken, but who had refused to be shattered. She watched as people moved through the gallery, their faces a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and awe. They lingered in front of her paintings, their eyes tracing the lines and curves, their expressions thoughtful and introspective. They were not just looking at her art, they were feeling it. And then she saw him, Victor. He was standing at the back of the room, his face a mask of disbelief. He was staring at the self-portrait, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was seeing her for the first time, not as the woman he had tried to mold and control, but as the woman she truly was. He saw the pain he had caused her, the years of quiet suffering, the slow, agonizing death of her spirit. But he also saw her strength, her resilience, her indomitable will to survive. He saw the woman he had lost, the woman he had so carelessly thrown away. He looked around the room, at the admiring faces, the hushed, reverent whispers. He saw the respect, the admiration, the awe that she commanded. And in that moment, he knew that he had not just lost a wife, he had lost a masterpiece. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He did not look back. He could not. The sight of her, in all her radiant, triumphant glory, was more than he could bear. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had departed, Mara and Johnson stood alone in the quiet, empty gallery. The room was filled with a sense of peace, a feeling of profound and deeply satisfying closure. "You did it," Johnson said, his voice soft with pride. She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. "We did it," she corrected him, her eyes shining with a love and gratitude that was so deep, so profound, it left her breathless. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "This is just the beginning, Mara," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, unwavering conviction. "This is just the beginning of your beautiful, brilliant life." And as she stood there, surrounded by her art, her hand in his, she knew that he was right. The past was a closed chapter, a story that had been told. The future was a blank canvas, and she was ready to paint her masterpiece. The success of Mara's exhibition was nothing short of phenomenal. The critics raved, the collectors clamored to buy her work, and she was hailed as the art world's newest and most exciting voice. She was no longer Victor Hale's ex-wife. She was Mara, the artist, a woman who had taken her pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something powerful, something that resonated with people on a deeply emotional level. The newfound fame was both exhilarating and overwhelming. She was inundated with interview requests, invitations to exclusive parties, and offers from galleries all over the world. It was a life she had never imagined for herself, a life that was a million miles away from the quiet, secluded existence she had once known. But through it all, Johnson was her anchor, her steady, grounding presence in the swirling vortex of her new life. He celebrated her successes, he comforted her in her moments of doubt, and he reminded her always to stay true to herself, to her art, to the woman she had fought so hard to become. Their relationship deepened, evolving from a friendship into a love that was as quiet and steady as it was passionate and profound. They were two souls who had found each other in the wreckage of their pasts. Two people who understood each other on a level that transcended words. Victor, meanwhile, was in a freefall. The public humiliation of the gala, followed by the spectacular success of Mara's exhibition, had been a devastating blow to his ego. He had lost his wife, his reputation, and his carefully constructed image of himself as a powerful, invincible man. He tried to salvage his pride, to put on a brave face for the world. He continued to parade Tiffany on his arm, to throw lavish parties, to spend his money with a reckless abandon that bordered on desperation. But the cracks were beginning to show. There was a hollowness in his eyes, a forced, brittle quality to his smile. He was a man who was haunted by his own ghosts, a man who was slowly but surely being consumed by his own bitterness. Tiffany, too, was beginning to see the man behind the mask. The charming, charismatic benefactor she had fallen in love with was gone, replaced by a bitter, angry man who was obsessed with his ex-wife. She was no longer his prize, his trophy. She was a distraction, a temporary balm for his wounded ego. The final straw came one evening when they were at a restaurant, and Victor, after having too much to drink, began to rant about Mara, his voice loud and slurring, his words filled with a venomous, impotent rage. He called her names, he disparaged her art, he tried to diminish her success, to paint her as a vindictive, manipulative woman who had orchestrated his downfall. Tiffany listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each vitriolic word. She saw him then for what he truly was, a small, pathetic man who was so consumed by his own jealousy that he could not bear to see anyone else happy. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. "I'm leaving, Victor," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked at her, his eyes bleary and unfocused. "What are you talking about?" he slurred. "I'm leaving you," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "I can't do this anymore. I can't live with this poison." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone at the table, a broken, defeated man in a crowded, indifferent restaurant. The news of their breakup was the final nail in Victor's social coffin. He became a pariah, a man to be pitied and avoided. His friends, who had once flocked to his side, now kept their distance. His business partners, who had once admired his ruthlessness, now saw him as a liability. He was alone, truly and utterly alone, in the gilded cage he had so carefully constructed for himself. Mara heard the news with a strange, detached sense of sadness. She had no love left for Victor, no desire for revenge. She had moved on, she had healed, she had found a happiness that was so pure, so profound, that it left no room for bitterness or resentment. She was sitting with Johnson on the terrace of their new home, a beautiful, light-filled house that overlooked the ocean. They were watching the sunset, the sky a blaze of orange and pink and gold. "Do you ever think about him?" Johnson asked, his voice soft. She knew who he meant. She didn't have to ask. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice a quiet whisper. "I think about the man he could have been, the man I thought he was." She turned to him, her eyes filled with a love and gratitude that was so deep, so profound, it was almost painful. "And then I think about you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "and I thank God that he wasn't." He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached all the way to his eyes. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss that was filled with all the love, all the hope, all the promise of their future together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and blue, Mara knew that she was finally, truly home. She was not just a survivor, she was a thriver. She was a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged, not just unscathed, but reborn. She was a masterpiece, and her life, her beautiful, brilliant, and gloriously imperfect life, was her greatest work of art. Life, for Mara, had settled into a rhythm of peaceful creativity and quiet joy. Her days were filled with the familiar, comforting scent of oil paints and turpentine, the gentle rhythm of waves crashing against the shore outside her studio window, and the steady, reassuring presence of Johnson. They had built a life together that was a world away from the gilded cage she had once inhabited, a life that was rich not in material possessions, but in love, respect, and shared dreams. Her art continued to flourish, her work gaining international recognition. She had exhibitions in Paris, London, and Tokyo, her paintings celebrated for their raw, emotional honesty. She had found her voice, her purpose, and she was using it to inspire others, to show them that it was possible to rise from the ashes, to find beauty in the broken places. But just when she thought she had finally left her past behind, it came roaring back into her life in the most unexpected and devastating way. It was a Tuesday morning, a day like any other. She was in her studio working on a new series of paintings when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, a local number from the city she had once called home. She hesitated for a moment, a strange, inexplicable sense of dread creeping over her. But she answered it, her voice a tentative, "Hello?" The voice on the other end was a woman's, a voice that was both professional and compassionate. She was a doctor, she said, from Hale General Hospital. She was calling about Victor. Mara's blood ran cold. She hadn't seen or spoken to Victor in years, not since the night of her gallery opening. She had heard whispers, of course, rumors of his decline, his social and financial ruin. But she had tried to put him out of her mind, to sever the last, lingering ties to her past. The doctor's words were a blur, a jumble of medical jargon that Mara couldn't quite comprehend. But she understood the gist of it. Victor was sick, very sick. He had been diagnosed with a rare, aggressive form of cancer, and he didn't have long. The news hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She sank into a nearby chair, her hand trembling as she held the phone to her ear. It wasn't grief she felt, not in the traditional sense. The love she had once had for Victor had died a long, slow death years ago. But there was a strange, hollow ache in her chest, a sense of a shared history, a life that had once been intertwined with hers, coming to an end. The doctor continued, her voice gentle. Victor was asking for her. He had no one else, she said. His family had long since abandoned him, his friends had disappeared, and Tiffany was a distant memory. He was alone, and he was scared. Mara didn't know what to say. What could she say? What did he want from her? Forgiveness? Absolution. A final, desperate attempt to rewrite the ending of their story. She ended the call, her mind reeling. She sat in her studio for a long time, surrounded by the vibrant, life-affirming colors of her art, and thought about the man who was dying, the man who had once been her whole world. She thought about the good times, the early days of their relationship, the laughter, the passion, the shared dreams. But she also thought about the bad times, the slow, insidious erosion of her spirit, the casual cruelty, the ultimate betrayal. She was torn. A part of her, the part that had been so deeply wounded by him, wanted to say no, to refuse his request, to protect herself from the pain and the turmoil that he always seemed to bring. But another part of her, the part that had been so carefully and lovingly nurtured by Johnson, the part that believed in compassion, in forgiveness, in the fundamental humanity that connects us all, knew that she had to go. She couldn't let him die alone. She couldn't be the kind of person who would turn her back on someone in their final moments, no matter what they had done to her. She found Johnson on the terrace, his face etched with concern. He had heard her on the phone, had seen the look on her face when she had hung up. She told him everything, the words tumbling out of her in a rush of confusion and fear. He listened patiently, his hand on her back, a steady, grounding presence. When she was finished, he didn't tell her what to do. He didn't try to influence her decision. He simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering love and respect. "Whatever you decide," he said, his voice soft and sincere, "I will be right here by your side." And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She had to go back. She had to face her past, one last time. Not for him, but for herself. She had to prove that she was no longer the woman who was defined by her pain, but the woman who had been transformed by it. She had to show him and herself that she was capable of a grace, a compassion, a strength that he had never known. The hospital was a sterile, impersonal place, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the quiet, hushed sounds of suffering. It was a world away from the sun-drenched beauty of her new life, a stark, unwelcome reminder of the fragility of human existence. Mara walked down the long, linoleum-floored corridor, her heart a heavy, leaden weight in her chest. Johnson was by her side, his hand a warm, reassuring presence in hers. He had insisted on coming with her, on being her silent, unwavering support. They found Victor's room at the end of the hall, a small private room with a large window that looked out onto a bleak, grey cityscape. He was lying in the bed, a shrunken, diminished version of the man he had once been. The cancer had ravaged him, stripping him of his vitality, his arrogance, his larger-than-life persona. He was pale and gaunt, his skin stretched thin over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. He looked up as they entered, and for a moment a flicker of the old Victor returned, a flash of pride, of defiance in his tired, pain-filled eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that she had never seen before. "You came," he said, his voice a hoarse, raspy whisper. She nodded, her throat tight with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Pity, sadness, a strange, unexpected sense of connection to this man who had caused her so much pain. She pulled up a chair and sat by his bedside, Johnson standing a respectful distance away, a silent, watchful guardian. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. The silence was not awkward, not uncomfortable. It was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid between them, all the years of love and loss, of hope and heartbreak. Finally he spoke, his voice so soft she had to lean in to hear him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words a painful, ragged breath. "I'm so sorry." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of regret, of remorse, of a pain that was far deeper than the physical agony that was consuming him. "I was a fool," he continued, his voice breaking. "I had everything and I threw it all away. I had you and I destroyed you." He looked at her then, his eyes pleading, desperate. "Can you ever forgive me?" Mara looked at this broken, dying man, and she felt a wave of compassion so profound it was almost overwhelming. The anger, the bitterness, the resentment she had carried for so long, it all just melted away. She took his hand, his skin cool and dry beneath hers. "I forgave you a long time ago, Victor," she said, her voice soft and steady. "I had to. I couldn't move on. I couldn't heal until I let go of the anger." A single tear traced a path down his sunken cheek. "You're a better person than I am," he whispered. "You always were." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes drifting to the window, to the grey, indifferent city outside. "I saw your exhibition," he said, his voice a little stronger now. "I saw your paintings." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a new, dawning understanding. "I never knew," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, unadulterated awe. "I never knew you had that in you, that fire." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in a very long time. And he saw her, not as his wife, not as his possession, but as a woman, an artist, a force of nature. "You were my masterpiece, Mara," he whispered, his voice thick with a final heartbreaking regret, "and I was too blind to see it." He closed his eyes, a faint, peaceful smile on his lips. He had said what he needed to say. He had made his peace. Mara sat with him for a long time, her hand in his, until his breathing slowed, until the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor faded into a long, unbroken silence. She walked out of the hospital, out into the cool evening air, Johnson's arm around her. She didn't cry. The tears would come later, she knew, but for now she felt a strange, profound sense of peace. She had faced her past, she had made her peace, and she had emerged, not just healed, but whole. She had learned that forgiveness was not about absolving the other person of their sins. It was about freeing herself from the prison of her own anger. She had learned that true strength was not about a lack of vulnerability, but about the courage to be open, to be compassionate, to be human. As they drove away from the city, away from the ghosts of her past, she knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the final, definitive closing of a long and painful chapter, and the beginning of a new one, a chapter that would be filled with love, with light, with the beautiful, brilliant and gloriously imperfect masterpiece of her life. What would you have done in Mara's place? Would you have gone to see Victor? Would you have forgiven him? Let me know in the comments below.